Hello, dear listeners, and a warm welcome to Soft History, the quiet place where the past comes to rest beside you in the dark. Tonight, we are going to travel far to the north, to a land of cold seas and long winters, and we are going to follow a people who began as simple farmers and ended up reshaping the whole world. Picture a single wooden ship, long and narrow and low in the water, cutting through grey waves toward a peaceful island where monks are praying, never imagining that this one morning will change the course of history. From that small ship would come centuries of voyages that touched England, Ireland, France, Russia, and even the shores of North America, 500 years before anyone else from Europe set foot there. This is the story of the Vikings, and it is far bigger and far stranger than the picture most people carry in their minds. We often remember them only for fire and fear, for raids and battles and helmets that they never actually wore. But the truth is much deeper than that. These northern people were explorers, traders, settlers, lawmakers, and shipbuilders whose ideas and bloodlines spread across the world and never fully left it. The story begins in a quiet, frozen homeland that few people ever visited, and it ends with their fingerprints pressed gently into the modern world we live in today. But before we go any further, I want to take a moment. On this channel, we explore fascinating subjects in calm and careful detail. These journeys are made to help you relax, focus, or simply enjoy the flow of discovery. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Is it day or night where you are? What time is it? Are you tuning in while studying, working, commuting, or simply winding down? Drop your answer in the comments below. It is always wonderful to hear from you. And if you enjoy content like this, please support the channel by liking this video and subscribing. It helps us bring you more of these journeys. So let us go back to the very beginning, to a place at the top of the world, where the land and the sea were locked together in cold and silence. Long before the first raid, before the first longship slid into open water, there was only the land itself. The northern part of Europe, that we now call Scandinavia, was a hard and beautiful place, made of deep valleys, dark forests, and long arms of seawater that reached far inland. These narrow inlets of water were called fjords, which were like quiet lakes that opened to the ocean, with steep stone walls rising on either side. The winters there were long and heavy, and for many weeks the sun barely climbed above the horizon. Snow lay thick across the hills, and the cold pressed down on every small home and farm. To live in this land, a person had to be patient, strong, and willing to work without rest from the moment the ground softened in spring. The people who lived here were spread out in tiny settlements along the coasts and rivers, because the inland forests and mountains were too harsh to farm easily. Most families lived in long wooden houses with a single open room, where everyone slept, ate, and gathered around a fire in the center. The smoke from that fire drifted up through a small hole in the roof, and the smell of burning wood and cooking soup filled the air all winter long. Outside, the wind howled across the snow, and inside, families huddled close to stay warm. There was very little flat farm land, and the growing season was short, so food was always a worry. Every harvest had to last through months of darkness, and a single bad summer could mean hunger before spring returned. Because the land gave so little, the people learned to look toward the water for almost everything they needed. The fjords and the sea were full of fish, and the coastlines were dotted with seabirds and seals. From their earliest days, the children of these settlements learned to handle small boats, to read the weather, and to understand the moods of the cold sea. The water was not a barrier to them, but a road, the easiest way to travel between scattered homes when the land itself was buried in snow or blocked by mountains. A family might live closer, by water, to a settlement many miles away than to a neighbor just over the nearest ridge. In this way, the sea shaped the way these people thought from the very beginning. It is easy to imagine why a people raised in such a place would one day turn their eyes outward. When you live where the land is hard and the winters are long, and when the sea is the open door in front of you every single day, the idea of sailing towards something better is never far from the mind. There were stories carried by traders of warmer lands to the south, of rich towns and green fields, and treasures piled inside stone buildings. For now, though, these were only stories, told quietly around the fire while the snow fell outside. The time of the great voyages had not yet come. The people of the north were still bound to their small farms, still counting their stores of grain, still waiting for each long winter to end. And yet, in those quiet centuries, everything that would later astonish the world was slowly taking shape. The skill with boats, the toughness bred by the cold, the deep knowledge of the sea, and the restless hunger born from a land that never gave enough. All of it was gathering, year after year, generation after generation, like a tide rising in the dark. The world to the south had no idea these people existed in any serious way. To the great kingdoms of Europe, the far north was a blank and frozen edge of the map, a place of legend and fog. But that quiet edge was about to wake. To understand what the Vikings became, we first have to understand who they were before the world ever feared them. For most of their lives, these people were not warriors at all. They were farmers, fishers, and craftspeople who spent their days tending animals, mending nets, working metal, and raising children in the cold. A typical family kept cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and grew what crops the short summer allowed, mostly barley, oats, and rye. The work never truly stopped. In spring they planted, in summer they tended and repaired, in autumn they harvested and slaughtered animals for winter, and in winter they survived. Their hands were rough from labor, and their lives were measured by the turning of the seasons rather than by years. The home was the center of everything, and the family was the heart of the home. Several generations often lived together under one long roof, sharing the same fire and the same daily struggles. The oldest and wisest members were respected, and children learned by watching and helping rather than by going to any school. Women held a great deal of power within this world, far more than in many other places of that time. A woman ran the household, managed the food stores, and held the keys to the family's wealth, often worn on a chain at her waist. When the men were away fishing, trading, or later raiding, it was the women who held the farms and families together. In this hard land, every person had to carry their share, and there was little room for anyone who could not. Beyond the family, there was the wider community, bound together by law and custom, rather than by kings or written rules. The Norse held meetings called things, which were gatherings where free men came together to settle disputes, make decisions, and speak their grievances aloud. There was no single ruler over all the people, only local chiefs and respected leaders whose power rested on the loyalty they earned. Honor was everything in this world. A person's good name, their reputation for being fair, brave, and true to their word, was treasured more than gold. To be called a coward or a liar was one of the worst things that could happen, and insults could echo through families for generations. This deep sense of honor would later drive much of what the Vikings did, both their loyalty to one another and their fierce response to any wrong. Their beliefs filled every corner of their lives, woven into the seasons, the sea, and the sky. The Norse worshipped many gods, each one tied to the things that mattered most in their hard world. There was Odin, the wise and mysterious god of knowledge and war, who gave up an eye in exchange for understanding. There was Thor, the strong and beloved protector, who carried a great hammer and brought thunder when he struck. There was Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and also war and death, who was honored at planting and at harvest. These were not distant gods who lived far away and ignored the world. They were close, powerful, and sometimes dangerous, and the Norse believed that bravery in life and a good death in battle could earn a place in a great hall in the afterlife. That belief shaped the way these people faced danger. If a brave death could lead to a hall of honor among the gods, then fear of death lost some of its power. This did not make them reckless, but it gave them a steadiness in the face of risk that few others had. They believed that fate was already woven, that the length of a life was set, and so it was better to live boldly and earn a good name than to hide and live in shame. When you put all of this together, the careful farmers, the proud families, the deep code of honor, and the fearless faith, you begin to see a people who were prepared, almost without knowing it, for an age of great and dangerous voyages. They were patient, tough, loyal, and unafraid, and they lived at the edge of an open sea. It would be wrong, though, to imagine them only as fighters waiting for war. They were also makers of beautiful things, skilled in working wood, metal, bone, and cloth. They carved patterns into wood and stone with great care, twisting animals and shapes into endless flowing lines. They were traders too, exchanging furs, walrus ivory, amber, and other northern goods for silver, glass, and fine cloth from distant lands. Long before they raided, they bartered, and the same skills that made them good merchants would later make them good explorers. The Norse were a complete people, with a full and rich way of life, and remembering this is the only way to truly understand the storm that was coming. If there was one single thing that turned these northern farmers into the most feared and far-reaching people of their age, it was the ship. Without their ships, the Vikings would have remained a small, hard folk on the edge of the world, known to no one. With them, they reached across oceans that no other people of their time would dare to cross. The longship was not just a boat. It was the finest piece of engineering in the whole of early medieval Europe, and it gave the Norse a freedom of movement that their enemies could barely imagine. To understand the Vikings, you truly have to understand these ships, because almost everything they became flowed from the wood and craft of these vessels. The longship was built to be both strong and light, fast and flexible, able to handle the open ocean and the shallowest river alike. The builders used long planks of oak, split rather than sawn from the tree, so that the wood kept its natural strength. These planks were laid so that each one overlapped the one below it, a method that made the hull both watertight and able to bend with the waves rather than break against them. The whole ship flexed gently as it moved through rough water, almost like a living thing breathing with the sea. This flexibility was a secret of its success, for a stiffer ship would have cracked where the longship simply rode the swell. The Norse shipbuilders had learned these lessons over many generations, passing their knowledge from father to son. A longship was a beautiful thing to see. It sat low and sleek in the water, sometimes 30 paces long or more, with a single tall mast in the center carrying one large square sail. That sail was often woven from wool and dyed in bold colors or stripes, so that a fleet coming over the horizon was a sight both grand and terrifying. At the front, the prow often rose high and curved, sometimes carved into the shape of a dragon or serpent's head, giving the ships their famous look. Along the sides, round wooden shields could be hung in a row, painted in bright colors. When the wind failed, the crew rowed with long oars through holes in the hull, dozens of men pulling together in steady rhythm, so the ship never had to wait for the weather to move. What made these ships so powerful was not just their speed, but their shallow bottom. Most large ships of that age needed deep water to float, which meant they could only reach proper harbors and stay near the coast. The longship was different. It sat so shallow in the water that it could sail right up onto a beach or travel far up a river into the heart of a country. This meant the Vikings could strike almost anywhere. They could appear suddenly on a quiet shore, run their ship straight onto the sand, leap out, and be gone again before any defense could gather. No one could guess where they would land next, because no coast and few rivers were safe. This single ability changed the rules of war and travel for the whole of Europe. The ships could also carry the Norse across truly open ocean, far out of sight of any land, which was something almost no other sailors of the time would attempt. The Vikings learned to read the sun, the stars, the flight of birds, the color of the water, and the movement of waves to find their way across the empty sea. They watched for clouds that gathered over distant land and for whales and seabirds that hinted at coastlines beyond the horizon. With these skills and their remarkable ships, they crossed the cold and dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, voyages that took great courage and great trust in their craft. Many ships were surely lost to storms and to the vast grey ocean, but enough returned with tales of new lands that others were willing to follow. It is hard to put into words just how far ahead of their time these ships truly were. While much of Europe still hugged its coastlines in heavy, slow vessels, the Norse were skimming across oceans and slipping deep into the rivers of distant lands. The longship gave them reach, speed, surprise, and the ability to go where no one expected. It turned a scattered people of small farms into a force that could touch 3 continents. Every raid, every settlement, every distant colony, and every river kingdom that the Vikings would later create rested on the wooden hulls of these ships. They were the key that unlocked the age that followed, and without them, the world might never have heard the name Viking at all. And so the ships were ready, the crews were ready, and the long quiet of the North was about to break. On a summer morning in the year 793, on a small island off the northeast coast of what we now call England, the wider world would meet the Vikings for the very first time. That island was called Lindisfarne, and it was a place of prayer and peace, home to a community of monks who had lived there for many years. These were holy men who spent their days in quiet worship, copying sacred books by hand and tending to the simple needs of their island home. They had no walls, no army, and no reason to expect danger from the sea. To them, the ocean was simply the world's edge, and the boats that came across it were friends or traders. The monastery at Lindisfarne was famous and respected across the land. It held beautiful treasures, golden cups and crosses, jeweled book covers, and the bones of holy men kept in fine cases. To the monks, these were sacred objects to be honored and protected, gifts to God built up over many years of faith. The island itself was a gentle place, joined to the mainland by a strip of sand that appeared and vanished with the tides. Seabirds wheeled overhead, the wind carried the smell of salt and seaweed, and the days passed in a slow rhythm of bells and prayers. The monks believed they were safe, far from the wars and troubles of the wider world, living quietly under the protection of heaven. They could not have known what was coming across the water. When the longships appeared on the horizon, the monks likely felt no fear at first. Ships came and went after all, and strangers usually meant trade or news. But these ships did not behave like traders. They came swiftly and silently, running straight up onto the beach, and from them poured armed men who moved with terrible speed and purpose. The peaceful island erupted into chaos. The raiders broke into the church and the buildings, seizing the gold and silver, tearing the jewels from the holy books, and carrying off everything of value they could find. Some of the monks were killed, some were dragged away to be sold far from home, and others fled in terror. In a matter of hours, a place of centuries-old peace was shattered. The raid itself was over quickly. The longships were pushed back into the waves, heavy now with treasure, and they slipped away across the sea as suddenly as they had come. Behind them, they left smoke, ruin, and a community broken by shock and grief. But the true power of that day was not in the gold that was taken. It was in the fear that spread outward from Lindisfarne like ripples across still water. News of the attack traveled far and fast, and everywhere it went, it carried the same message. The sea was no longer safe. A new and unknown danger had come from the cold and distant north, striking without warning at the holiest of places. People across Europe were horrified, and they struggled to understand what had happened. In a deeply religious age, an attack on a house of God was almost beyond belief. Learned men wrote letters filled with shock and sorrow, asking how such a thing could occur, wondering if it was a punishment from heaven for the sins of the people. To them, these raiders seemed to come from nowhere, fierce and godless, with no respect for anything sacred. They had no name for these attackers yet, no understanding of who they were or where exactly they came from. They knew only that the men had arrived by sea in long, swift ships and had vanished back into the grey water with everything of worth. The raid on Lindisfarne is often called the beginning of the Viking Age, and in many ways it was. It was the moment the quiet, hidden world of the North reached out and touched the rest of Europe, and nothing would be the same again. For the Norse, it was proof of something they had only guessed at before. The rich lands to the south were full of treasure, poorly defended, and easy to reach with their ships. For everyone else, it was the start of decades of fear, the first cold drop of a storm that would soon break over many lands. The monks of Lindisfarne had simply been praying on a peaceful morning, and through no fault of their own, they had become the first to feel the long age that was now beginning. After Lindisfarne, the raids did not stop. They grew. What began as a single shocking attack became a rising tide of violence that swept along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and the lands across the sea in what is now France and beyond. Each year more ships came, and each year they grew bolder. At first, the raids were small and quick, a few ships striking a coastal town or monastery and slipping away before any help could arrive. But word of the riches to be found spread quickly through the northern lands, and soon more and more young men wanted their share. The early raiders returned home with silver, gold, fine cloth, and captives to sell, and their success drew others to follow in their wake. The monasteries and churches were among the first targets, and it is easy to understand why. They held great wealth in a single place, gathered over many years and guarded by men of prayer rather than men of war. To the Norse, who did not share the Christian faith of these lands, there was nothing holy about these places to hold them back. A church full of gold was simply a church full of gold, undefended and waiting. So the raiders struck them again and again, all along the coasts and up the rivers, leaving ruin behind them. The monks who survived often fled inland, carrying their precious books and the bones of their saints, abandoning the shores to the sea raiders. Whole communities moved away from the coast just to escape the reach of the longships. What made the Vikings so hard to stop was the very thing that made their ships so remarkable. They could appear anywhere, with no warning, and be gone before any army could be gathered to face them. In those days, kingdoms were slow to react. There were no standing armies waiting on the coast, no fast way to send word of an attack, and no fleet able to catch the swift longships at sea. By the time a local lord raised his men and marched toward a burning town, the raiders had long since sailed away with their plunder. The Vikings used this perfectly. They struck where defenses were weakest, avoided strong points, and never lingered long enough to be trapped. It was a kind of warfare that the kingdoms of Europe were simply not built to fight. As the years passed, the raids changed in scale and ambition. Single ships became fleets, and small bands became armies. Instead of striking and leaving on the same day, the Vikings began to stay longer, setting up camps on islands and riverbanks from which they could raid an entire region over a whole season. They learned the lands they attacked, made deals with some local rulers, and turned others against each other. They even began to demand payment to leave places in peace, and frightened kings often paid them great sums of silver just to make them go away. Of course, this only encouraged more raids, for the Vikings learned that fear itself could be turned into treasure. Each payment told them that the southern lands were rich and weak. It would be easy to see only cruelty in all of this, and there was certainly suffering and loss. Towns burned, families were torn apart, and people lived in fear of the sea for the first time in their lives. This part of the story is one that must be told honestly, even in a quiet telling like this one. But it is also worth understanding why the raids happened at all, for the Norse were not simply driven by a love of violence. Their homeland was poor and crowded in places, with little good land to go around. Younger sons often had no farm to inherit and no future at home. The raids offered them wealth, honor, and a path to a better life that their own land could not provide. To them, this was a way to rise in the world. So the years of fire and plunder rolled on, decade after decade, reshaping the map of fear across Europe. The name of the Northmen became a thing whispered with dread from the coasts of Ireland to the rivers of France. Prayers were even said in some churches asking to be spared from the fury of these raiders from the north. And yet, even in this dark and frightening age, something else was quietly beginning to happen. The Vikings were no longer content just to raid and leave. They were starting to look at these rich green lands with different eyes, not only as places to plunder, but as places to stay. The age of raiding was slowly, almost without anyone noticing, turning into something far longer lasting. The change came gradually, the way the tide creeps up a beach without anyone seeing it move. For years the Vikings had come and gone, taking what they wanted and sailing home before winter. But over time, more and more of them chose not to leave. Instead of returning north when the raiding season ended, they began to spend the winters in the lands they had once only attacked. They built camps that became villages, and villages that became towns. They brought their families across the sea, or took wives in their new homes, and they began to farm the very land they had once raided. The raiders were slowly becoming settlers, and this quiet shift would change Europe far more deeply than any raid ever could. Nowhere was this clearer than in England. Over the course of many years, a large Norse army moved through the English kingdoms, not just to plunder, but to conquer and hold. They took control of vast stretches of land, especially in the north and east. and the region they ruled came to be known as the Danelaw, the area where Danish law and custom held sway. Here the Norse settled in great numbers, founding and growing towns, ploughing fields, raising animals, and living much as they had in their homelands, only on richer soil. The names of many English towns still carry the marks of these settlers today, ending in sounds that the Norse brought with them. In these places, the line between raider and neighbor slowly faded away. Life in these settled lands was a strange mixture of old and new. The Norse newcomers lived alongside the people who had been there before, sometimes uneasily, sometimes peacefully. They traded with one another, married into one another's families, and learned each other's ways. The Norse brought their skills as farmers, traders, and craftsmen, and their towns became busy centers of buying and selling. Markets grew where goods from many lands changed hands, and silver flowed through the streets. Over the generations, the sharp differences between the settlers and the local people began to soften and blend. Children grew up speaking a mix of both tongues, and the cultures slowly wove together into something new. This blending was one of the most important things the Vikings ever did, far more lasting than any treasure they carried off. Where they settled, they did not simply replace the people who were there. They mixed with them, adding their own words, customs, and blood to the lands they joined. The English language itself was changed by this meeting, taking in many everyday Norse words that are still spoken every single day. Words for simple things like sky, egg, knife, window, and even the word they. The way people governed themselves, settled disputes, and organized their towns also drew from Norse ways. The settlers left a mark not on the surface of these lands, but deep within them, in the very speech and habits of the people. Of course, this peace was never simple or complete. There were still wars and rebellions, still kings who fought to drive the Norse out or to bring them under control. The English kingdoms did not give up their lands easily, and there were long struggles for power between the newcomers and those who sought to push them back. At times the Danelaw grew, and at times it shrank, as the fortunes of war shifted back and forth. But even when the political maps changed, the people remained. The Norse families who had put down roots did not simply vanish when a battle was lost. They stayed, and they kept on living, working, and mixing with their neighbors, season after season, generation after generation. This was the great turning point in the Viking story, the moment when they stopped being only a force of destruction and became a force of creation. They were building towns, shaping languages, forming new communities, and laying down roots that would outlast them by 1,000 years. The same restless energy that had once driven them to raid now drove them to settle, to trade, and to grow. And while England was one of the great stages for this change, it was far from the only one. Across the seas, in lands far emptier and wilder than England, other Norse families were setting out on a different kind of journey. They were not looking for towns to conquer, but for empty lands to claim as their own. While some Vikings turned south toward the rich kingdoms of Europe, others looked out across the vast and empty North Atlantic, toward lands that almost no one had ever seen. These were the great explorers of the Norse world, people willing to sail into the unknown in search of new homes. The first great prize of this western journey was an island far out in the cold ocean, a place of fire and ice that the Norse came to call Iceland. It was a wild and lonely land of black volcanic rock, steaming hot springs, towering mountains, and wide empty plains. No people lived there when the Norse arrived, only a few wandering monks who soon left. For families seeking land of their own, This strange new island was a chance to start a completely new life. The settlers who came to Iceland were often people who felt crowded out at home, or who had quarreled with powerful chiefs and kings. In Iceland, there were no kings at all, and that was part of the appeal. The settlers built their own society from the ground up, founding farms across the open land and governing themselves through their gatherings and their laws. Once a year, the free people of the island would travel to a great open-air meeting where they made decisions, settled disputes, and shared news. This gathering was one of the earliest lasting assemblies of its kind in the world, a place where ordinary free men had a voice. Life was hard on this cold island, but it was theirs, and they built a proud and lasting community far from the lands of their birth. From Iceland, the Norse pushed even farther west, toward an even harsher and more distant land. The man most famous for this next step was a fierce and stubborn figure known as Eric the Red, named for the color of his hair and beard, and perhaps for his temper as well. Eric had been forced to leave first Norway and then Iceland because of violent quarrels, and with nowhere left to go, he sailed west into the unknown ocean. There, he found a huge land of ice and stone, cold and forbidding, with only narrow strips of green along its sheltered coasts. Most people would have seen only a frozen wasteland, but Eric saw a chance to start again, far from the enemies he had made behind him. Eric gave this harsh place a hopeful name. He called it Greenland, partly because of the green meadows that did grow in its southern fjords during the short summer, and partly, it is said, because a pleasant name would draw more settlers to follow him. And follow they did. Ships full of hopeful families crossed the dangerous sea to join him, though many were lost to storms and ice along the way. Those who arrived found a difficult but beautiful land, where they built farms, raised animals, and hunted seals and walrus along the coasts. They sent precious goods like walrus ivory back to Europe, trading across thousands of miles of cold ocean. For a time, these settlements held on, tiny clusters of life clinging to the edge of a frozen world. It is hard for us to truly imagine the courage these voyages required, to sail out into open ocean in an open wooden ship, with no land in sight for days, not knowing for certain whether anything lay ahead at all, took a kind of bravery that is difficult to put into words. The cold was brutal, the storms were deadly, and the sea stretched on without end in every direction. Many who set out never arrived, swallowed by waves and fog and ice. Those who did reach these distant shores faced lives of constant hardship, scraping a living from thin soil and freezing waters. And yet they did it, again and again, driven by the same restless spirit that ran through all their people, the hunger for new land and a fresh start. These settlements in Iceland and Greenland were remarkable achievements in their own right, far-flung outposts of the Norse world in some of the loneliest places on Earth. But they were not the end of the journey west. From Greenland, the Norse were now perched at the very edge of the known world, gazing across yet another stretch of cold sea. And there were whispers, carried back by sailors blown off course, of land even farther to the west, a flat, dark line on the horizon, forests where there should be only ocean. The idea took hold in the minds of bold and curious people, the idea that there might be another land out there entirely, waiting beyond the western water. It was an idea that would lead to one of the most astonishing journeys in all of human history. The story of how the Norse reached this new land begins, as so many great discoveries do, with an accident. A trader sailing toward Greenland was blown far off course by a storm, and through the mist he caught sight of a strange coastline he did not recognize. low and wooded, unlike the icy shores he knew. He did not land there, but he carried the tale home, and it lodged in the minds of those who heard it. Among them was a young man named Leif, the son of Eric the Red, who had grown up on stories of voyages and new lands. Bold, curious, and eager to prove himself, Leif decided he would find that mysterious western shore for himself, and so he gathered a crew and set out across the unknown sea. Leif and his men sailed west from Greenland into waters where no one they knew had ever deliberately gone. After days at sea, land finally rose from the ocean before them, but it was not the land they had hoped for at first. The first place they found was cold and bare, a coast of flat rock and ice, with little of value and no welcome for settlers. They did not stay. Sailing onward, they came to a second land, this one flat and covered in dark forest that ran down nearly to the shore, with wide beaches of pale sand. It was a gentler place than the first, but still they pushed on, sensing that something even better might lie ahead. Their patience and courage were about to be rewarded. At last, they came to a land that seemed almost too good to be true after the cold and emptiness behind them. Here the rivers ran full of fish, the grass grew thick and green, and the weather was milder than anything they knew in Greenland. There were forests for timber, which was precious to the treeless Greenlanders, and wild grapes or berries grew in such plenty that Leif named the place Vinland, the land of vines. To these northern people, accustomed to ice and stone, it must have seemed like a paradise. They built shelters and decided to spend the winter there, exploring the new land and gathering its riches. For the first time, people from Europe were living on the shores of a continent that the rest of their world did not even know existed. This was a moment of staggering importance, even though almost no one at the time understood it. Around the year 1000, 5 whole centuries before the famous voyages that would later connect Europe and the Americas, the Norse had already crossed the ocean and set foot on the shores of North America. They had reached a new continent in their open wooden ships, guided only by the sun, the stars, and their own hard-won skill. It was one of the greatest feats of exploration in the entire history of the world, and it was achieved by a people from a cold and distant corner of the map. The land they found was vast beyond their imagining, stretching away for thousands of miles that they would never see or know. But the Norse stay in this new land did not last. The settlers were few in number, and they were impossibly far from home, separated by a wide and dangerous ocean from any help or support. The land was already home to other peoples, and over time, meetings between the Norse and these native inhabitants turned tense and sometimes violent. With so few settlers, so far from any support, and facing hostility on these unfamiliar shores, the Norse could not hold on. After only a few years, they gave up their settlement and sailed back to Greenland, leaving the new land behind. The grand discovery faded into memory and then into legend, remembered only in the stories the Norse told around their fires for generations to come. For centuries, the wider world had no idea that any of this had happened. The Norse voyages to the west were forgotten or dismissed as mere tales, and the honor of reaching the Americas was later given to others who came long afterward. Yet the truth remained, written into the old stories, and, much later, confirmed when the remains of a small Norse settlement were found on a far northern shore of North America. Proof that the Vikings had truly been there. It is a humbling thought that a small band of people in wooden ships reached a new world so quietly that history nearly lost the memory of it. Their settlement did not last, and their discovery led to nothing lasting at the time. but it stands forever as a mark of just how far these northern travelers were willing to go. While some Vikings sailed west into the empty ocean, others turned in an entirely different direction, toward the east, and there they would shape the future just as deeply, though in a very different way. These were mostly Norse from the eastern lands, and instead of crossing open seas, they followed great rivers deep into the heart of Eastern Europe. The land there was vast, with mighty rivers flowing for hundreds of miles through endless forests and wide plains. These rivers were like roads leading south, all the way toward distant and wealthy lands, and the Norse, masters of the boat, were perfectly suited to travel them. They came not only as raiders, but as traders, carrying furs, honey, wax, and other goods, and seeking the silver and luxuries of the rich south. These Eastern Norse became known by a name that would echo through history. The local peoples called them the Rus, and it is from this name that the land of Russia would one day take its own. The Rus traveled the rivers in their boats, and where the rivers could not carry them, they hauled their boats overland from one waterway to the next, a back-breaking task across rough country. Along these river roads, they set up trading posts and strongholds, places where goods could be gathered, guarded, and exchanged. Over time, some of these posts grew into real towns, busy with merchants and craftsmen and full of the wealth that trade brought. The Rus were building a network of routes and settlements that tied the cold north to the warm and golden south. In time, these scattered trading towns began to come together under stronger leaders, and something like a state began to form. The Rus leaders gathered power, collected tribute from the surrounding peoples, and ruled over growing territories from their fortified towns. One of the greatest of these centers grew along the rivers and became a powerful seat of rule, drawing wealth and people to it. From these beginnings rose the first great state of the Eastern Slavs and the Norse together, a realm that mixed Norse rulers with the local people they governed. Just as in England, the Norse here did not stay separate forever. They blended with the people around them, taking on their language, their customs, and eventually their faith, until the Norse and the local peoples became one. The wealth that flowed along these eastern rivers was staggering. The Rus carried furs and other northern treasures south and brought back silver coins from distant lands, fine silks, glittering glass, and other luxuries. Great hoards of silver coins from far-off southern empires have been found buried across the northern lands, proof of just how rich and far-reaching this river trade truly was. This was not the quick and violent wealth of a raid, but a steady river of riches built on travel, trust, and trade across enormous distances. The Rus connected worlds that had barely known of one another, linking the frozen north with the sun-warmed empires of the south through the long highways of the rivers. In doing so, they laid the foundations of trade routes and towns that would matter for centuries. What makes this part of the Viking story so remarkable is that it shows the Norse in a role we rarely picture them in. Here, they were not just raiders or even settlers, but founders of states and shapers of nations. The very roots of one of the largest countries on Earth can be traced back, in part, to these northern travelers who came down the rivers so long ago. The name of the land itself carries the memory of them. They brought their skills, their boldness, and their organization, and they used them not to destroy but to build, creating towns, trade, and rule where there had been scattered peoples before. The cold water sailors of the far north had become the builders of an empire in the heart of a continent. It is a strange and wonderful thing to think about, how a single people could reach so far in so many directions at once. The same hunger that drove some Norse to seek empty land in the icy west drove others to seek wealth and power along the rivers of the east. Their longships, built for the cold seas of home, carried them up rivers and across plains they could never have imagined from their fjords. And everywhere they went, they left something behind: a name, a law, a road, a town, a bloodline. The Rus were one of the clearest examples of this, a people who began as northern traders and ended as the founders of nations. And from their river towns, the boldest of them looked still farther south, toward the greatest and richest city in all the world. That city was Constantinople, the shining heart of a vast and ancient empire, and to the Norse who reached it, it must have seemed like something out of a dream. It stood far to the south, guarding the meeting point of two seas, and it was the largest and wealthiest city the Rus had ever seen or heard of. Within its mighty walls lived hundreds of thousands of people, far more than in any town the Norse knew at home. Its streets were full of merchants from across the world. Its markets overflowed with silks and spices and gold, and its great churches rose so high and so grand that they seemed to touch the heavens. To the river travelers from the cold north, this golden city was the very edge of wonder, the prize at the end of the long road south. The Rus traveled down the great rivers and across the seas to reach this city, carrying their goods to trade in its busy markets. They brought furs, honey, wax, and other northern treasures, and they carried home silks, jewels, wine, and silver. The journey was long and dangerous, full of rapids, raids, and hardships, but the rewards were great enough to make it worthwhile again and again. Over time, the people of the great city came to know these northern traders well, and a steady stream of goods and silver flowed between them. The Norse even attacked the city at times, hoping to seize its wealth by force, but its mighty walls held firm against them. In the end, trade proved far more rewarding than war, and the two peoples settled into a long and profitable relationship. The most famous link between the Norse and this great city came in the form of a body of warriors known as the Varangian Guard. The rulers of the empire came to value the strength, loyalty, and ferocity of the northern fighters so highly that they hired them as their personal guard. These were tall, fierce men from the cold lands of the north, far from any local politics or family rivalries, and so they could be trusted to protect the emperor himself. They stood watch over the palace, fought in the empire's wars, and earned great wealth and fame in service to a foreign ruler far from home. To serve in this guard was a great honor, and many young Norsemen made the long journey south hoping to win silver and glory in the emperor's service. Some grew rich beyond their dreams and returned home as legends. The wealth that flowed back north from this service and trade was enormous. Norsemen who served in the great city or traded in its markets brought home silver, gold, fine cloth, and stories of wonders beyond imagining. They carved messages into stone back in their homelands, telling of relatives who had traveled to the great city and the rich southern lands, some never to return. This deep connection stretched across thousands of miles, linking the cold fjords of the north to the warm and glittering streets of one of the greatest cities on earth. It is astonishing to think of these northern people, born among ice and stone, standing guard in marble halls and walking streets paved with the wealth of an empire. Their reach truly spanned the known world, from the western edge of the ocean to the gates of the Golden East. This long arm of Norse travel and trade shows just how far their world really stretched. We often picture the Vikings only along the coasts of Britain and the cold northern seas, but their true range was vast beyond easy belief. From the shores of North America in the far west to the great city of the east, from the icy settlements of Greenland to the busy river towns of the Rus, they touched a span of the world that few peoples of any age have matched. They were tied together not by a single empire or a single ruler, but by their ships, their boldness, and their endless hunger to see what lay beyond the next horizon. Wherever wealth, land, or adventure could be found, the Norse seemed to find a way to reach it. And yet, even as their traders walked the streets of the Golden City, the Viking world at home was changing. The age of scattered chiefs and small bands was slowly giving way to something larger and more powerful. Out of the many local leaders and warlords, great kings were beginning to rise, men who dreamed not just of raiding distant lands, but of ruling them. The same energy that had once sent small fleets to plunder a coast was now gathering behind ambitious leaders who wanted crowns and kingdoms of their own. The Viking story was entering a new and grander stage, the Age of Kings, when the Norse would no longer just raid the kingdoms of Europe, but would come to rule some of the greatest of them. As the Viking Age moved on, the Norse world grew more organized and more ambitious. The scattered chiefs who had once led small bands of raiders gave way to powerful kings who ruled whole lands and commanded great armies. In the homelands of the north, strong leaders fought to bring the many small chiefdoms under their control, forging the first true kingdoms of Scandinavia. These kings were no longer content with raiding for treasure. They wanted lands, crowns, and lasting power, and they had the wealth and the warriors to chase those dreams. The age of small raids was giving way to an age of great conquests, when entire kingdoms might fall not to a single fleet, but to the will of a single determined king. The greatest stage for this new ambition was once again England, the rich and tempting land just across the sea. After many years of raids and settlement, a powerful Norse king set his sights on ruling the whole of England, not just a corner of it. This was no simple raid, but a full campaign of conquest, with great fleets and large armies crossing the sea to make a king of the north into a king of England as well. The struggle was long and hard, with battles, betrayals, and shifting fortunes on both sides. But in the end, the Norse triumphed, and a Danish king came to rule over all of England, a remarkable turn for a people who had first arrived as raiders on its shores. The descendants of sea raiders now wore the crown of a great kingdom. The most famous of these Norse rulers of England was a king named Knut, often remembered as Knut the Great. He was not only king of England, but also ruled over lands in the north, holding together a great realm that stretched across the northern seas. Under his rule, England knew a time of relative peace and stability, and Knut governed not as a cruel conqueror, but as a wise and capable king. He respected the laws and customs of the people he ruled, supported the church, and worked to bring his many lands together under one strong hand. For a time, this northern king held sway over a sea-spanning kingdom, a vast realm linked by the very waters that his people had always traveled. It was the height of Norse power, the moment when a Viking king sat upon one of the great thrones of Europe. There is a famous story told about King Knut that has lasted through the ages, though it may be more legend than fact. It is said that to teach his proud followers a lesson, the king had his throne carried to the edge of the sea as the tide was coming in. There he commanded the waves to stop and not to wet his feet or his robes. Of course, the sea took no notice of his command, and the water rolled in around him as it always had. The king then turned to his courtiers and told them that the power of earthly kings was empty and small, for only the true power above could command the seas. Whether the story is true or not, it captures something real about how these Norse rulers came to see themselves as great but still humble before forces larger than any crown. The rise of these Viking kings marked just how far the Norse had come from their humble beginnings. The people who had once lived in small farms on the cold edge of the world now ruled kingdoms, commanded fleets, and shaped the politics of all of Europe. They were no longer outsiders striking from the sea, but rulers seated at the very center of power, making and unmaking kings and drawing the map of nations. The blood of the northern farmers now ran in the veins of royalty, and the descendants of raiders gave laws to lands their ancestors had only plundered. It was a transformation as deep as any in their long story. The change from sea robbers to crowned kings in just a few generations. Yet even at this height of power, the world the Vikings had known was quietly slipping away. The old ways, the old gods, and the old wild freedom of the raiding age were beginning to fade. As the Norse settled, ruled, and mixed with the peoples of Europe, they took on new beliefs and new ways of living that softened the fierce edge of their earlier age. Among the deepest of these changes was one that touched their very souls, a change in the gods they worshipped and the faith they followed. For centuries, the Norse had honored their old gods of war and weather, of love and death. But now a new faith was spreading northward, carried by traders, by missionaries, and by the kings themselves, and it would change the Norse world forever. The new faith was Christianity, and it came to the Norse land slowly, like the first light creeping over a long, dark winter. For most of their history, the Norse had worshipped their old gods, the powerful and mysterious figures of their ancient beliefs. These gods had been with them through every storm and every harvest, honored in their homes and their gatherings, woven into the very fabric of their lives. But as the Norse traveled, traded, and settled among Christian peoples, they met this new faith again and again. They saw its churches, heard its teachings, and watched the power and wealth of the Christian kingdoms around them. Slowly, the new beliefs began to take root in the northern soil, growing alongside the old ones before finally beginning to replace them. The change did not happen all at once, nor did it happen easily. For many years, the old faith and the new lived side by side, sometimes peacefully and sometimes in tension. Some Norse took up the new faith eagerly, drawn by its teachings or by the advantages it brought in dealing with Christian kings and traders. Others held tightly to the old gods, unwilling to abandon the beliefs of their fathers and the ways that had carried their people for so long. In many places, people honored both for a time, hedging their bets between the old powers and the new. There were objects made that showed symbols of both faiths together, as if their makers were not yet ready to let go of one world while reaching for another. It was a slow and tangled passage from one age into the next. The kings played a great part in this change, for when a king took up the new faith, his people often followed. Some rulers embraced Christianity out of true belief, while others saw the political wisdom in it, for becoming Christian opened doors to alliances and respect among the Christian kingdoms of Europe. Once a king was baptized, he often worked to spread the new faith among his people, building churches, supporting priests, and discouraging the old worship. Sometimes this was done gently, through teaching and example, and sometimes it was done with force and pressure. Bit by bit, the new faith spread across the Norse lands, carried from the top, down by the very rulers who had once led raids on Christian shrines. The descendants of those who had burned monasteries now built churches of their own. With the coming of the new faith, much of the Old Norse world began to fade away. The temples and sacred places of the old gods fell quiet, and the open worship of those gods slowly came to an end. The great festivals and rituals of the old beliefs gave way to the rhythms of the new faith, with its own days, prayers, and customs. The old stories of the gods were not entirely forgotten, for some were later written down and preserved, which is why we still know them today. But as living beliefs, they faded into memory, replaced by the new faith that now shaped the lives of the Norse people. A whole way of seeing the world, ancient and deep, gently passed out of daily life, like a fire burning low and at last going out. This change touched far more than just religion. With the new faith came new ways of writing, new laws, new connections to the wider Christian world, and a new place for the Norse among the nations of Europe. They were no longer seen only as fearsome outsiders, but as fellow members of the Christian family of kingdoms. This brought them more firmly into the politics, trade, and culture of Europe, binding them ever closer to the lands they had once raided. The wild and separate world of the early Vikings was being woven into the larger tapestry of Christian Europe, its sharp edges softened, its differences slowly worn away. The Norse were becoming, in many ways, simply Europeans, sharing the same faith and many of the same customs as their neighbors. In this quiet turning from one age to another, we can feel the Viking Age beginning to come to its close. The old gods were fading, the raids were growing fewer, and the Norse were settling ever more deeply into the lands and ways of the wider world. The fierce energy that had once sent longships across every sea was being channeled into kingdoms, churches, and trade. The world that had trembled at the appearance of dragon-headed ships was changing, and so were the people who had sailed them. But before the long age of the Vikings finally ended, there would be one last great moment, one final clash of arms that has come to mark, in the minds of many, the very end of the Viking Age. It came on a single dramatic day in the autumn of the year 1066. The year 1066 is one of the most famous in all of history, and at its heart lies a battle that brought the Viking Age to a close. In that year, a great and fearsome Norse king named Harald Hardrada set his sights on the throne of England. He was a legendary warrior, a man who had traveled far and fought in many lands, even serving in the famous guard of the great city in the east, before returning home to claim a crown. He was tall, fierce, and battle-hardened, the very picture of the old Viking spirit, and he believed England should be his. With a great fleet and a powerful army, he sailed across the sea to take the kingdom by force, just as Norse kings had done before him. It was to be one last great bid for conquest in the old tradition. Harold and his army landed in the north of England and at first met with success, winning a battle and taking the surrender of a great northern city. It must have seemed, for a moment, as though the old days had returned, as though another Norse king might soon wear the English crown. But the English king at the time, Harold, was not willing to give up his throne without a fight. He gathered his army and marched north with astonishing speed, covering a great distance in a short time to surprise the invaders. The Norse, confident after their early victory, were not expecting him so soon. They were caught off guard, many of them resting and unarmored, far from their ships, when the English army suddenly appeared before them on a quiet day in late September. The battle that followed took place at a river crossing known as Stamford Bridge, and it was fierce and bloody. The English fell upon the surprised Norse, and a desperate fight broke out across the bridge and the fields beyond. There is a famous tale that a single Norse warrior, held the narrow bridge alone for a time, cutting down all who tried to cross, until at last he too was struck down. Whether fully true or not, the story captures the courage and desperation of that day. The fighting was hard, but the English had the advantage of surprise and numbers, and slowly the Norse were overwhelmed. In the thick of the battle, Harald Hardrada himself was struck down and killed, the great warrior king falling far from his home on an English field. The defeat at Stamford Bridge was total. The mighty Norse army that had sailed across the sea was shattered, and so few survived that only a small number of their many ships were needed to carry the broken remnant home. The dream of a Norse king ruling England died there on that bloody field, along with one of the last great warriors of the Viking world. It was a stunning end to a bold campaign, and it marked, in the eyes of history, the close of the great age of Viking conquest. The kind of grand invasion that Harold had attempted, the Sea King coming to seize a throne by force, would never truly happen again. The long storm that had begun so many years before at Lindisfarne was at last beginning to die down. There is a final, fateful twist to the story of that year. Even as the English king celebrated his great victory in the north, another threat was gathering across the sea to the south. Within days of the battle, a new invader landed on England's southern shore, and the exhausted English army had to turn and march all the way back down the length of the kingdom to face him. Worn out from their hard-won victory and their long marches, they met this new enemy in another great battle and were defeated, and their king was slain. So the very year that saw the last great Viking invasion crushed also saw England fall to a different conqueror, one whose own ancestors had themselves been Norse settlers generations before. In this way, the threads of the Viking story wove together even in their ending. The death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge is often taken as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. The great raids and grand invasions faded, the longships sailed less and less on missions of war, and the Norse settled ever more firmly into the ordinary life of medieval Europe. The fierce and restless age that had reshaped so much of the world drew gently to its close, like the last waves of a storm rolling quietly onto a shore. But though the age of the Vikings was ending, the Vikings themselves did not simply vanish. They lived on in the lands they had settled, in the kingdoms they had founded, and in the blood, the words, and the ways of countless people across Europe and beyond. Their age was over, but their mark would never fade. What the Vikings left behind is far greater and far more lasting than the treasures they once carried off in their ships. Long after the last raids ended and the longships rotted on the shores, the marks of the Norse remained pressed deep into the world. We can see them most clearly in language, in the very words that millions of people still speak every day without knowing their origin. In English alone, countless everyday words came from the Norse settlers, simple words that we use without a second thought. The way we speak was changed forever by their presence, woven through with the speech of the North. Every time these words are spoken, an echo of the Vikings sounds again, faint but unbroken. After more than 1,000 years, the Vikings also left their mark on the land itself, in the names of places that still appear on maps today. Across the regions where they settled, towns, villages, rivers, and hills still carry names that the Norse gave them so long ago. These names dot the countryside like quiet markers of a vanished people, telling us where the settlers once farmed, traded, and made their homes. In some places, the very shape of how people governed themselves, settled disputes, and organized their communities drew from Norse ways and laws. The idea of free people gathering to make decisions together, so important in the Norse world, left its trace on the lands they touched. In all these quiet ways, the Vikings shaped not just the moment of their age, but the foundations of the world that came after. Perhaps the deepest mark the Vikings left is in the people themselves, in the bloodlines that spread across so much of Europe and beyond. Wherever the Norse settled, they married, raised families, and mixed with the people already there, until the line between Norse and native faded away entirely. The blood of the Vikings runs today in countless people who have no idea they carry it, in lands stretching from the icy north to the green fields of England and Ireland, to the rivers of the east, and across the sea to distant shores. One of the most striking examples is the region in northern France that took its very name from the Northmen who settled there. From that single corner of Norse settlement would come people who went on to conquer and shape lands far across the world. The story of those Norse settlers in France is a remarkable thread in the larger tale. They had come, like so many others, as raiders, and they were given land in exchange for peace, settling along the coast and mixing with the local people. Over a few generations, these descendants of Vikings became a powerful and ambitious people in their own right, known across Europe for their skill in war and their hunger for new lands. From this single region, they spread their power across the sea and into distant kingdoms, becoming rulers and conquerors far from where their Norse ancestors had first landed. It is a perfect example of how the Viking influence did not end with the Viking Age, but flowed onward through the people they became, reaching places and times the old raiders could never have dreamed of. The Vikings also helped to shape the wider world through the trade routes and connections they built. Their long journeys across seas and down rivers tied together distant lands that had barely known of one another, moving goods, ideas, and people across enormous distances. The towns they founded grew into important centers of trade and life, some of which are still great cities today. The routes they opened and the connections they made helped to weave the early threads of a more connected world, linking north and south, east and west. In this way, the restless travels of the Norse did more than carry treasure home. They helped to stitch together a wider web of human contact and exchange that would only grow in the centuries to come. When we add all of this together, the language, the place names, the laws and customs, the bloodlines, the founded nations, and the trade routes, we begin to see just how deeply the Vikings shaped the modern world. They were not only raiders to be feared, but explorers who reached new continents, traders who connected distant lands, settlers who built towns and farms, and founders who helped give rise to nations. The world we live in today still carries their fingerprints in 1,000 quiet ways, most of them so woven into ordinary life that we never even notice them. A small people from a cold and distant land left a mark on history far larger than their numbers ever were. The blood that stayed behind has flowed onward through 1,000 years, and it flows still. And so we come, at last, to the quiet after the long storm. We have traveled a great distance together tonight, from the frozen fjords of the north to the shores of a new world in the west, from the river towns of the east to the golden city of the south, and back again to the gentle close of a mighty age. We have followed a people who began as humble farmers on the cold edge of the world and went on to touch 3 continents, to found nations, and to shape the very words we speak. Their age was loud with the crash of waves, the creak of timber, and the clamor of distant shores. But every storm, in time, gives way to stillness, and so too did theirs. Picture now a single longship, old and worn, drawn up at last upon a quiet northern beach as the light fades from the sky. Its sailing days are over, and it rests upon the sand where the gentle waves lap softly against its weathered wood. The wind that once filled its sail now only whispers through the grass on the dunes above. The sea stretches out before it, calm and grey and endless, the same sea that carried it to the far corners of the world. The voices of the men who sailed it are long since silent, carried away on the tide of years, and the ship simply rests there in the gathering dark, its great journeys done, its long story told, settling softly into the quiet of the night. So let the world grow still around you now, as still as that quiet shore at the end of the day. The long age of the Vikings has come to its gentle close, and the storm has faded into peaceful silence at last. Thank you for traveling with me through this long and distant story, and for letting these old voyages carry you toward rest. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your own dreams sail gently across calm and quiet waters. Good night.